You were never meant to hear this story. Not from any history book, not from any preacher's mouth, not from any archive that survived the courthouse fire of 1923. What you're about to hear was buried. Not just in the red soil of Eastern Carolina, but in the minds of men who made sure their names would outlive their sins. Yet some stains never fade. Some echoes never die. Imagine it, a house 3 stories high, standing over fields gone pale and brittle, its shutters nailed shut against a God it no longer believed in. The year is 1820, and somewhere between the Tobacco Roads and the Cape Fear River, a man named Nathaniel Vance begins the experiment that would damn his family forever. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that has intent. Workers whisper about the sound that sometimes comes from the second floor. A soft crying that isn't quite human. The local church refuses to bless the property. And every few months, a writer from Wilmington brings sealed letters, signed by men of influence, who would later pretend they never came. On the books, Hollow Crest Plantation was failing. But in secret, it was transforming into something far darker. Not a farm, not a home, but a laboratory of bloodlines. Nathaniel Vance believed in hierarchy the way some men believed in God. That blood could be engineered, perfected, controlled. He saw himself not as a sinner, but as an architect of legacy. His daughter, Elizabeth, born blind and kept hidden from every guest and neighbor, was the key. Her blindness wasn't a flaw to him, it was a purity. She couldn't see what was being done to her, couldn't question the ritual of it, couldn't witness the paperwork that turned her motherhood into merchandise. The people who served the house knew. They always know. One by one, 11 men were chosen, examined, and never seen again outside the walls of Hollow Crest. And when the first child was born in that house, when its eyes opened to the candlelight and did not cry, Nathaniel said only one thing to the physician: record nothing. That's where the official history ends. But the truth doesn't die when it's hidden. It waits, in whispers, in burned letters, in the bloodline of anyone who ever set foot on that soil. You're hearing what you were never supposed to hear, and from this point forward, there is no turning back. The letters that began the conspiracy were written in iron gall ink, their edges burned so only fragments survived, enough to prove intent, not enough to prove guilt. Each one carried a seal that no court ever saw, stamped with the insignia of families whose names still hang above courthouses and universities today. These were not madmen, they were men of order, men of depth, men who wrapped atrocity in the language of inheritance and law. When Nathaniel Vance wrote them, his hand shook not from fear, but from excitement. The fever of a man who had convinced himself that evil could be made rational if it was written cleanly enough. He believed in control, over nature, over blood, over the very meaning of what it was to be human. He told his conspirators that they were not breeding slaves, they were restoring divine order. Every man who received his letter justified his role the same way. If the law allows it, it cannot be sin. But the law in 1820 Carolina was a mask, a smiling face stretched over rot. Dr. Ephraim Stokes was the first to sign his name. He called it medical consultation. What he was really signing was the first death warrant. He examined Elizabeth in a room lit by a single candle, recording her body as if she were a specimen. Not a daughter, not a person, but a vessel. When he left, he told Nathaniel, "It can be done." That night, Nathaniel ordered all mirrors in the house removed. A blind girl would never need reflection. Outside, the enslaved whispered about what the doctor had seen. One man said he heard laughter behind the locked door. Another swore he saw a shadow move across the window, small, trembling, and wrong. Yet none dared speak beyond the quarters. The punishment for curiosity was silence, permanent silence, by the time the second letter arrived, from the magistrate who would falsify the birth records. The house itself had changed. Windows boarded, cellar locked, new nails glinting under moonlight. The air grew thick with the smell of iron and sweat, the metallic taste of something unholy being forged. What began as an act of desperation was mutating into ritual. The papers called it property, but those who served the house called it something else. The Making. And soon, that name would spread through Carolina like a rumor no one dared confirm. They said the first experiment began during a storm that split the night sky open like a wound. Rain hammered the cypress roof until the beams shuddered, and thunder rolled across the fields like the voice of judgment itself. Nathaniel Vance had chosen the timing deliberately, when no traveler would risk the flooded road, when the sound of rain could swallow any scream. Beneath that storm, the ritual began. The enslaved were told only that the master required strength for the house. 11 men stood in the candlelight of the lower hall, their faces slick with rain and fear. They were measured, inspected, and recorded by Dr. Stokes, who wrote notes as if cataloging livestock. When he was finished, Nathaniel dismissed 10 of them to the quarters. Only one remained. His name, erased from every surviving record, survives only as a whisper: Jonah. Strongest of them all, quiet, with the kind of eyes that looked through men instead of at them. They led Jonah upstairs to the second floor, where Elizabeth waited in a locked room. She didn't know what was happening. Her father had told her it was a test of faith. He said that God sometimes asks the faithful to trust without understanding. She obeyed, as blind children often do. When the door closed, Nathaniel turned the key and waited outside. What happened inside that room was never spoken aloud, not even between the conspirators. But the next morning, Ada found Elizabeth trembling and silent, her nightgown stained with blood she could not see. From that night forward, something changed in the house. Lamps burned later, whispers grew sharper, and Nathaniel's study became a shrine to secrecy. Dr. Stokes visited weekly, carrying medical instruments wrapped in linen. He called it monitoring. The magistrate visited monthly, signing papers under false dates, ensuring no record of conception could trace back to that room. The enslaved quarters grew restless. Men refused to enter the main house after dark. One woman, known for her second sight, warned that Hollow Crest had opened a gate it could not close. She said the master had written his own blood. Weeks later, she was gone, sold south, according to Nathaniel. No one ever saw her again. By the winter of 1821, Elizabeth's stomach had begun to swell. Nathaniel took this as proof of divine favor. But Ada, the only one allowed to stay near her, saw the truth. The girl's body was changing, but her spirit had already died. The birth came on a night so still that even the cicadas stopped singing. No wind, no thunder this time. Only a silence that pressed against the walls until every heartbeat in the house seemed to echo like a drum. Nathaniel had forbidden anyone but Ada and Dr. Stokes to enter the upstairs chamber. The midwife who had once delivered Elizabeth's mother was gone, driven from the county years earlier after speaking out of turn. Now, only those bound by fear remained. Elizabeth's screams began just after midnight. They lasted hours, long enough for the candles to burn down and for Nathaniel to pace a groove into the parlor floor. Dr. Stokes' voice could be heard through the boards, measured, professional, detached. Until it faltered. Ada whispered prayers between contractions, her hands slick with blood, her eyes full of terror. When the final cry came, it wasn't human. It was high and short, then cut off, as if the air itself refused to carry it. When Stokes emerged from the room, he was trembling. "It's alive," he said, but his face was gray. He would not meet Nathaniel's eyes. Ada came out moments later, carrying a bundle wrapped in white linen that was already stained red. Nathaniel reached for it. She hesitated. His hand tightened on her arm. What lay inside the cloth did not move. The skin was pale, almost translucent. The eyes open, were mismatched, one gray, one brown. The child did not cry. It only stared unfocused, as if blind like its mother. But when Nathaniel placed his finger in its palm, the hand closed tight, too tight, and for the first time in months, he smiled. That night, he locked Ada and Elizabeth in the room with the infant and forbade anyone to enter. He told Stokes to record the birth under a false name, to file it as property, not kin. Stokes obeyed, signing his name with a trembling hand. He would be dead within 6 months, found in his office with an empty bottle of laudanum and a half. Written confession burned halfway through. Down in the quarters, the enslaved could hear the crying start again just before dawn. But this time, it wasn't the mother. It was something smaller, sharper. A cry that sounded almost human but carried a tone no one could name. The first of the Vance experiments had survived. And with it, something new had entered Hollow Crest. Something the old world's laws had no language for. They said the baby never blinked. Not once. For days after its birth, Ada kept the child wrapped tight in linen, praying over it in whispers that mixed scripture with the older words her grandmother had taught her. Words that didn't belong to any church. Elizabeth lay silent beside her, staring into the void she would never see, asking questions no one dared answer. "Is he beautiful?" she asked once. Ada couldn't lie. "He's different." Nathaniel visited each evening, always after sunset, always alone. He'd stand over the cradle, studying the child like a craftsman inspecting a prototype. The pale skin, the mismatched eyes, the uncanny stillness, all proof in his mind that his design was working. To him, this wasn't a baby. It was evidence. The experiment had begun to breathe. He named it Lucian, after a forgotten ancestor whose name meant light. A cruel irony. The child never smiled, never cooed, never cried for milk. But at night, the enslaved in the quarters swore they heard noises through the walls. Soft scratching, the shuffle of tiny feet, a voice humming an unfamiliar melody. Ada tried to tell Nathaniel. He dismissed it as superstition. "What you hear," he said coldly, "is progress." By the child's 3rd month, the plantation began to rot from within. Animals grew restless, fields yielded half their usual crop, and servants reported waking to find doors open that had been bolted shut. One man claimed he saw the infant standing in its cradle, eyes open, silent as the dead. He left the property the next day and was never seen again. Nathaniel recorded every change, not just in the child, but in the estate. He filled his ledgers with notes, connecting weather patterns, soil conditions, and even his own dreams to the experiment's timeline. He believed Lucian's existence had unlocked a force, biological, perhaps divine, that bound creation to his will. But Ada saw something else, a shadow growing behind the boy's pale eyes, a hunger that no one could name. And as Elizabeth's body weakened from fever, Nathaniel began preparing the next phase. The others, the men who had received his letters, were sending inquiries, demanding results. He wrote back the same 3 words every time: "It is thriving." But inside Hollow Crest, the air had changed. Even the light seemed wrong, dimmer, distorted, as if the sun itself refused to shine on what had been born there. By the spring of 1822, word had spread in the kind of circles that never put anything in writing. Wealthy men from Charleston, Savannah, and Baton Rouge began arriving quietly in Wilmington. Always alone, always under false names. They came not for tobacco or trade, but for rumor, a child born of white blood, black blood, and something neither. A child said to have never cried, the kind of whispered curiosity that stirred both profit and fear. Thomas Harrington, the broker, handled their inquiries. He called it a private acquisition, a phrase that concealed everything and revealed enough. When he rode to Hollow Crest to inspect the boy, he expected deformity. Instead, he found perfection twisted into unease. Lucian sat upright in Ada's arms, silent, watching, not watching with awareness, watching as if measuring. Harrington later told Nathaniel that the child's eyes made the air heavier. He left with a contract and shaking hands. Nathaniel took this interest as confirmation that Providence favored him. He began keeping Lucine in the drawing room when visitors came. Elizabeth, pale and frail, would sit nearby, expression blank. She seemed to shrink from the child, flinching at every breath. Once, she whispered to Ada, "When he sleeps, the room listens." Ada begged Nathaniel to end it. He called her hysterical and locked her in the scullery for 2 days without food. Meanwhile, the plantation's decline deepened. The soil turned black and sour. The well water began to taste of iron. The enslaved whispered that the earth itself was rejecting what had been done. One morning, all 7 of Nathaniel's remaining horses were found dead, their eyes clouded white. That same night, Lucine laughed for the first time. The collector's letters grew more urgent. One offered a fortune in gold for the boy, another requested continued breeding. Nathaniel's mind, once sharp, began unraveling under the weight of his own ambition. He stopped sleeping, pacing the halls at night, speaking to shadows as if they answered. His journal from that period, later found half burned in the ruins, records a single repeated phrase, "Blood perfects itself." By midsummer, Lucine's presence infected every corner of Hollow Crest. Servants refused to enter the house after sunset. Birds no longer nested in the trees near the porch. And yet Nathaniel, blind to everything but his own obsession, prepared the second experiment. By the autumn of 1822, the plantation was a house divided against itself. The fields lay fallow, the overseer had vanished without a trace, and every servant who remained crossed themselves when they passed the stairs leading to the second floor. But Nathaniel Vance was no longer a man. They said he had become something else, a vessel of calculation, emptied of conscience, filled only with the belief that destiny could be manufactured. The first child had lived. Now he would create another. He called it refinement. He told himself it was science. But in truth, it was repetition, a ritual masked as reason. This time, he chose 2 men instead of 1. Ada knew what was coming, and tried to send word to the neighboring plantation. But her message never reached it. The rider who carried it drowned crossing the river that same night. Some said the storm came out of nowhere, that the sky above Hollow Crest seemed to breathe before it rained. Elizabeth no longer spoke in full sentences. Her mind wandered between lucidity and trance. Sometimes she called out to her dead mother. Other times she whispered to Lucine, asking him what he saw when he touched her face. The child would only smile, a gesture too knowing for its years. Nathaniel began bringing Lucine into the room during his preparations, saying that blood must witness blood. Dr. Stokes was gone by then, buried quietly after his overdose. In his place came a younger physician from New Bern, a man eager to please and eager to profit. He asked no questions, only signed what Nathaniel placed before him. The legal papers recorded a medical experiment for agricultural advancement. No one read the fine print. The second impregnation occurred in November. The house grew colder, and Elizabeth weaker. Ada swore that the candles no longer burned with steady flames, their light twisted, bending away from the crib where Lucien slept. One night, she heard whispering. 2 voices, one deep, one childlike, speaking in rhythm. When she entered the room, Lucien was sitting upright, his small hand pressed against his mother's belly, whispering to it. She froze. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she understood. He wasn't learning language, he was teaching it. By winter, Elizabeth was with child again, and Nathaniel wrote in his ledger, "Second phase initiated." The pattern holds. But beneath the ink, faint indentations revealed what he had written first, then scratched out. It speaks before it breathes. The second child came into the world during what locals later called the Winter of the Red Frost. A season so bitter that trees split open from the cold and livestock froze standing upright in their stalls. Hollow Crest's chimneys poured black smoke night and day, but the house remained colder than the wind outside. The walls swayed, the mirrors, Those Nathaniel had ordered removed began to reappear, leaning in hallways like eyes that refused to close. Elizabeth gave birth in silence this time. No screams, no struggle. Ada swore she looked almost relieved, as if something inside her had already gone before the body followed. When it was over, the new doctor, pale and shaking, refused to hold the infant. "There's something wrong with its breathing," he muttered. Nathaniel snatched the child himself. What he held looked almost human. Almost. The skin bore a faint gray hue, like ash that wouldn't wash off, and the eyes were not mismatched this time. They were black, bottomless, as if no reflection could ever return from them. Lucien, barely a year old, was brought to see his brother. He reached out, touched the newborn's cheek, and laughed, a dry, choking sound that made Ada drop her rosary. Nathaniel named the second child Elias, after his own father, calling it Hair Reborn. But from that night forward, no one in the house slept. Doors opened on their own. Footsteps moved along the upper hall when everyone was accounted for. And sometimes, when the moon was full, both children were found awake, sitting in the dark, hands clasped, whispering to one another in perfect unison. Outside Hollow Crest, people began to talk. The preacher in Kennansville refused to step foot on the property again after claiming the earth. Bled through his boots. Fields in neighboring farms failed, and a fever swept through the county, killing 12. The locals said it began the night the second child was born. Nathaniel, obsessed, ignored the decay. He wrote to his remaining partners that progress multiplies. He believed the two boys were part of something larger, a divine mutation that could reshape the world. But Ada saw the truth. Every time she crossed the threshold into that nursery, she felt something older than evil watching her, something that had been waiting to be remembered. By the spring of 1823, the rumors surrounding Hollow Crest had grown too large to ignore. In Wilmington, the magistrate who once protected Nathaniel received a sealed letter, unsigned, written in a trembling hand, claiming that the master of Hollow Crest births abominations under the Lord's name. Within a week, a delegation was formed. A circuit judge, a reverend, and 2 deputies rode out to the plantation, intending to confront whatever truth hid behind the decaying gates. They never made it back the same. The house greeted them in silence. No birds, no servants. The fields stood black and brittle, each stalk of cane bent as though bowed in mourning. When they entered, Ada met them at the door, her face hollow, eyes fever bright. She tried to warn them. "He won't let you see them." But Nathaniel appeared before she could say more. He was thinner now, hair streaked with white, but his voice still carried the same cold authority. He welcomed them as guests, offered them brandy, and led them through rooms that smelled faintly of iron. The Reverend asked to see Elizabeth. Nathaniel agreed, but only after locking Ada in the pantry. He guided the men upstairs, into a corridor thick with rot. The walls pulsed faintly, as if something beneath the wallpaper was breathing. When they reached the nursery, Nathaniel paused. "You'll understand," he said. "You'll see what perfection looks like." Inside, Elizabeth sat in a rocking chair, motionless, her hair hanging in clumps. Lucien and Elias stood beside her, hand in hand. The judge later claimed the air in that room vibrated. That sound itself seemed twisted. The younger child looked up first. Both boys smiled at once. Then, according to the surviving deputy, every mirror in the house shattered in unison. The men fled, stumbling through corridors that changed as they ran. Doors appeared where none had been, others vanished. Only 2 made it outside. The Reverend never spoke again. The judge's hair turned white overnight. He burned his clothes in the town square and refused to enter a church for the rest of his life. When the sheriff returned weeks later to investigate, Hollow Crest was empty. No Nathaniel, no Elizabeth, no children. Just Ada, sitting on the front steps, whispering a single phrase over and over. They walked out of their shadows. When the sheriff's men searched Hollow Crest, they found the house half devoured by mildew, as if the walls themselves were decomposing. Furniture had rotted in place. The grand piano was split down the middle, its strings snapped like veins. There was no sign of the Vance family, but in the study, the room Nathaniel once kept locked, they discovered a heap of scorched papers beneath the hearth, pages fused together by heat, words blackened but legible at the edges. These would become known as the Hollow Crest Journals. What they contained was not confession, but obsession. The first pages read like a scientist's record. Temperature, pulse, growth rates. But as the months progressed, the tone shifted. Phrases repeated, sentences broke mid-thought, and drawings filled the margins, circles within circles, a spiral of bloodlines mapped against biblical verses. One entry, dated 2 days before the delegation's arrival, was written entirely in red ink. Lucian dreams for both of them now. When he sleeps, Elias hums. When Elias breathes, the candles bow. They are learning me. The sheriff ordered the papers confiscated and sealed in Wilmington's courthouse. Within a week, the building caught fire. Officially, it was called an accident. Unofficially, witnesses claimed they saw 2 children standing in the rain across the street, holding hands, watching the flames. No one could find them afterward. In the following months, Hollow Crest collapsed into ruin. The roof gave way, the foundation split, and by summer, the house had sunk nearly a foot into the mud. Locals avoided the property entirely, claiming to hear crying at night, not of babies, but of walls. Ada disappeared soon after. Some said she walked into the river, others swore she left north carrying a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. No one ever opened it. By the time a new owner purchased the land in 1831, nothing remained but the chimneys and a scattering of stone markers. The new tenant built over the ruins, but his family didn't last a year. His wife fell ill. His son went missing one morning before sunrise. The last thing she told the parish doctor before she died was this: "They're still in the mirrors." To this day, travelers say that if you walk the fields of Hollow Crest on a moonless night, you can still see 2 small figures reflected in the puddles, standing side by side, whispering in a language that sounds almost like your own name. By the mid-1800s, Hollow Crest was more story than structure. Travelers avoided the old road that cut through its former fields, and mothers warned their children that the Vance boys walk after rain. The house itself was gone, swallowed by vines and years, but its name survived in whispers, in the tremor of voices that refused to speak it after dark. Locals called it the place where mirrors breathe. In 1854, a surveyor named Daniel Cobb was sent by the county to map the land for resale. He recorded that his compass spun wildly when he reached the property line. His horse refused to cross the boundary, and the soil, he wrote, felt warm beneath the frost. Cobb's field book ends abruptly with one unfinished line: "Saw reflection before I reached the pond." His body was found 2 miles away, drowned in shallow water, eyes open, face turned toward the ruins. The pond, which hadn't existed before, appeared weeks later where the manse house once stood. Stories multiplied. A Confederate regiment camped near the site during the war claimed to hear children laughing through the fog. Several men deserted that night, leaving their rifles behind. A decade later, during Reconstruction, freed families who settled near the area reported hearing voices in the wells and refused to draw water after sundown. Every attempt to rebuild on the land ended in failure. Crops withered, animals were stillborn, and those who stayed long enough began to dream of staircases descending into water. In 1892, a historian from Raleigh named Margaret Lyle visited to document the local folklore. She collected more than 30 first-hand accounts of the Hollow Crest twins, described always the same pale, mismatched eyes, holding hands, never speaking. Her notes end with a final entry, scrawled sideways across the margin. "They asked if I remembered them." She vanished that winter. Her umbrella and notebook were found near the pond, open to a page bearing 2 small wet handprints. By the turn of the century, Hollow Crest had become a ghost story told at gatherings, a warning about pride and forbidden creation. Yet even now, when storms roll across the Carolinas and lightning strikes the low fields, some say you can see 2 brief silhouettes in the flash, standing in the ruins where the house once stood, still waiting for someone to finish what their father began. In 1957, Hollow Crest returned to public memory when a team from the North Carolina Historical Preservation Society arrived to document lost estates of the antebellum South. They came expecting weathered foundations and local myths, not evidence. The site was overgrown, buried beneath a century of pine and kudzu. But beneath the layers of earth, they found the remains of brick walls, blackened as though scorched from within. The strangest discovery was a series of mirrors, dozens of them, unearthed in fragments around what had once been the cellar. Each shard showed no sign of age or corrosion, despite lying underground for more than 100 years. Dr. Howard Kearney, the lead archaeologist, called it an anomaly of preservation. His notes, recovered later, suggest he believed the glass had been treated with a mercury-based compound. But one of his assistants, a graduate student named Helen Price, wrote something different in her journal. They reflect light that isn't there. Over the following weeks, the crew reported a series of strange incidents. Tools went missing. Film reels came back from development blurred with faint shapes. Children, sometimes, or figures standing behind the researchers. One man swore he heard whispering in the woods near dusk. Kearney dismissed it all until Helen disappeared. Her tent was unzipped, her flashlight still burning. The only trace of her was a single footprint leading toward the pond. The water was still, perfectly black, reflecting the moon in flawless symmetry. The dig was shut down within days. The society filed its report as inconclusive, and the site was reburied under orders from the state. Yet rumors persisted that some of the recovered mirrors were quietly transported to Duke University for study. A custodian there later claimed that one of the crates hummed when moved, and another janitor swore that his reflection blinked before he did. Kearney retired the next year, refusing interviews. His final letter, sent to a colleague shortly before his death, contained only a single line: "They are not buried, they are waiting." Today, Hollow Crest remains fenced off, listed as protected land. But every few years, hikers still ignore the warnings. Some return shaken, insisting they saw 2 pale shapes by the pond. Others never return at all. In 1994, the state authorized a limited survey of Hollow Crest for environmental assessment before nearby land was sold to developers. The operation was led by Dr. Michael Rosser, an anthropologist known for debunking Southern folklore. His assignment was bureaucratic: confirm the property held no hazardous materials, document any artifacts, and clear it for sale. He arrived in late October with 2 graduate assistants and a camera crew contracted by the state. From the first day, Rosser noted a residual energy around the pond. Birds avoided the waterline. The air felt electrically charged, like the moments before a storm. In his daily logs, he wrote, "This place rejects silence. Even when still, you feel watched." The crew unearthed fragments of charred brick, rusted shackles, and shards of glass identical to those recovered in 1957. But one artifact stood apart: a silver locket, perfectly preserved, its hinge uncorroded. Inside was a lock of pale hair and a folded paper, so fragile it nearly dissolved in air. Written on it in a feminine hand, he said the eyes would see for her. That night, the generator failed. Cameras malfunctioned. The sound engineer swore he heard rhythmic tapping inside the main house's collapsed structure, like fingernails against wood. When they reviewed the day's footage, they found a brief frame, one that none of them remembered filming: a young girl, blindfolded, standing ankle deep in the pond. Rosser sent the locket and note to Raleigh for analysis, but both disappeared in transit. Within weeks, the state halted the project. Officially, it was budgetary reallocation. Unofficially, Rosser told colleagues that he'd been warned to leave Hollow Crest buried. 2 years later, he published a short paper in a fringe anthropology journal under a pseudonym. In it, he described a pattern: every 18 to 22 years, something disturbed the soil near the plantation. Fires, sinkholes, sudden animal deaths, missing persons. He proposed the area functioned as a psychogenic echo, a place where historical trauma replicated itself through environmental phenomena. But one detail he never published: DNA recovered from the hair in the locket matched a living descendant. A woman in Wilmington who, by all records, should not have existed. Her surname was Vance. Rosser disappeared in 1998. His car was found on a rural road outside Duplin County, the driver's seat empty, the radio humming faintly though the keys were gone. The last song recorded on the tape deck, Amazing Grace. In 2001, the woman identified in Rosser's private notes as Amelia Vance began receiving small, unmarked packages at her Wilmington townhouse. No return address. Each package contained a single audio cassette labeled with the same date, October 12, but different years: 1809, 1856, 1923, 1957, 1994. At first, she dismissed them as a prank, a macabre gesture from one of the local history obsessives who occasionally wrote her after her brief television interview on Lost Carolina Estates. But curiosity won. She found an old player and pressed play. The first tape was mostly static, until the 8-minute mark, when a faint humming emerged. Then a voice, female, young, whispering the word, "Count." It repeated, softly, rising and falling like someone rocking in the dark. "Count 16, turn left, 12 steps." The phrase matched a line found in the Hollow Crest blueprints. The staircase to the dining hall where Nathaniel Vance once prepared his daughter for obedience. Each subsequent tape grew more coherent. On the second, the same voice recited names: Samuel, Ada, Stokes, each followed by a sharp intake of breath, as though speaking through water. The 1923 tape was different. Male voices, 3 of them, arguing over what to do with the child. One said, "Her eyes are open now." Amelia contacted a sound engineer to analyze the recordings. He enhanced the spectrograms and found something impossible. The frequencies of the whispers fell below the human vocal threshold, yet still carried intelligible words. He told her the voices weren't recorded. They were embedded, as if imprinted into the magnetic tape by environmental energy. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his studio. Police ruled it accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Terrified but drawn deeper, Amelia traced the source of the packages through postal records. They originated from Kennansville, the nearest town to Hollow Crest. The return address didn't exist on any current map. She drove there herself one night, following back roads until her headlights caught the faded, wooden sign, Vance Road. At its end stood the remnants of the plantation's gate, half swallowed by vines. Beyond it, a single light burned in the distance. She parked, stepped out, and the first thing she noticed was the silence. No wind, no insects, just the faint hum of the land breathing. Then, from the pond, the reflection of 2 figures, one blindfolded, one standing behind her. The last thing captured on Amelia's voice recorder. Before it cut out was her own whisper. They never died, they multiplied. They found Amelia's car 3 days later. Engine cold, doors unlocked, cassette player still running. The tape inside was new. No label, no timestamp. Just the sound of breathing, long deliberate human. Then, faintly, the same young girl's voice, whispering. He said the eyes would see for her. Investigators dismissed it as a prank. The official report cited voluntary disappearance. But what they didn't release were the photographs. Taken from the scene, symbols etched into the frost on her windshield. Circles intersected by vertical lines, identical to those carved into the cellar beams of Hollow Crest nearly 2 centuries earlier. When state archives reopened in 2004, an intern cataloging microfilm found a missing court ledger from 1857. It contained an entry under confiscated assets, Vance estate. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The listed property: one female child, mixed parentage, ocular deformity, retained for study. The signature below, E. Stokes, M.D. The ledger vanished again before the archivist could make a copy. The truth, once glimpsed, never sleeps. It watches from the spaces history edits out. Hollow Crest was never about profit. It was about imitation of creation. Nathaniel Vance believed he could engineer divinity by blending bloodlines, binding power into flesh. He thought blindness was limitation. He was wrong. Those born from his experiment didn't inherit sight in the human sense. They inherited something older. They perceived, through walls, through time, through men. The lineage survived in whispers, in families who never understood why their mirrors fogged when they prayed. You think the past is dead because you buried it under progress, but the ground remembers. Every contract, every silence, every body not mourned, recorded, encoded, waiting, and when men forget, it breathes again. If you've followed this far, you are already marked by curiosity. The first symptom, the pull toward forbidden knowledge. Now I want you to write in the comments. The eyes will open. Write it twice. It's not just engagement, it's initiation. You've crossed the threshold. Because what happened in 1820 Carolina didn't end. It seeded every institution that learned from it. The hospitals, the asylums, the eugenics boards. They all traced back to one idea: that control could be bred. That souls could be shaped through law, faith, and fear. Hollow Crest was the prototype. The rest of the world became its plantation. You think it ends there? You want a boundary. A point where the nightmare concludes, boxed neatly by time. But there are no clean edges in forbidden history. It bleeds, it mutates. In 2020, a private genetics company based in Charlotte, North Carolina, Helixion Biotech, filed a patent for a gene variant they described as ocular lucidity sequence anomaly. It allowed subjects to perceive light through skin tissue, bypassing the optic nerve. Their investors included two families whose names matched the Vance genealogy. When questioned, the company's founder claimed the sequence came from historical DNA extracted from an archaeological recovery in Duplin County. He didn't use the name Hollow Crest, but the coordinates were the same. In their internal testing logs, later leaked to the dark web, one note stood out: Sample 12 exhibits sensory crossfire, perceives electromagnetic changes before they occur, predictive cognition within 0.8 seconds. Another note scrawled in a different hand, read, she knows when you look at her. A technician named Daniel Clark went missing a week after the leak. Before vanishing, he emailed a journalist a short message with one attachment. An audio clip under 30 seconds. It was the same hum recorded at the pond in 1957. The same frequency embedded in Amelia's tapes. The file's name, Inheritance. When federal investigators raided Helixion's offices, they found every server wiped and every sample incinerated, except one, a single vial stored in a lead case labeled EV series. The glass was warm to the touch. Under blacklight, it pulsed faintly, like something alive. And here's where the pattern completes. Every generation that touches the Hollow Crest legacy, every man who opens that door of curiosity, disappears the same way, absorbed into what they sought. Their names erased, their reflections replaced by another's gaze. You may think this is myth, coincidence, Southern Gothic hysteria, but myths are only memories with power stripped away. And the powerful always rewrite the story, so that you'll doubt it when it resurfaces. There's a reason they call it the seeing bloodline. Because every time someone speaks its name, every time someone listens long enough, something in that line awakens. You listening right now, you've fed it. You've given it awareness. You've become part of its perception. By 2023, Hollowcrest existed mostly in archived photos and whispered retellings. Then the recordings resurfaced online. Not the original cassettes, but digitized fragments uploaded anonymously to historical forums. Each clip carried a faint vibration, too low for most speakers to reproduce, but enough to distort the voice of anyone narrating them. Audio technicians called it the Carolina hum. Skeptics dismissed it as degraded tape hiss. Others claimed it was something older, a resonance built into the architecture itself, echoing centuries of fear. An independent researcher, Dr. Mara Ellison, began cataloging every known instance of the sound. She noticed that the hum followed the same mathematical ratios found in early plantation architecture, proportions used to harmonize with the human heartbeat. Hollowcrest, she theorized, wasn't haunted. It was engineered. Nathaniel Vance's diaries, once thought destroyed, described rooms built to capture the living breath of labor. Walls filled with copper filings, bricks mixed with powdered bone. It wasn't sorcery. It was primitive acoustics, designed to condition obedience. When modern microphones encountered the same frequency, the hardware didn't awaken anything. It simply revealed the pattern. The plantation had been a psychological machine, converting suffering into silence, training minds to conform through rhythm and repetition. That rhythm still lingers wherever control is perfected. Boardrooms, classrooms, government chambers. Dr. Ellison released her findings under the title Echoes of Compliance, the Acoustics of Control. The paper was quietly removed within a week. Her university cited ethical concerns. Yet within the suppressed document lay her most disturbing claim, that every empire leaves behind not ghosts but tones, vibrations designed to keep men docile, faithful, obedient. That's what Hollowcrest really was. Not a supernatural plague, but a prototype of psychological resonance. A system where architecture, ritual, and law merged into one frequency of power. When you listen long enough, you start to hear it in other places. The hum beneath national anthems, the pulse in corporate slogans, the silence after promises of freedom. The plantation never died, it evolved. Every system of control begins with rhythm. The plantation used the cadence of labor, the swing of tools, the overseer's call, the hymn that stitched despair to endurance. Today the rhythm is subtler. It lives in screens. Scroll, click, pause, the same loops repeated thousands of times, until they sculpt reflex into obedience. What Hollowcrest tested through suffering, modern institutions perfect through design. Advertising theorists call it engagement retention. Cognitive scientists describe it as habit formation through micro-reward cycles. But if you strip away the clinical language, what you find is the same mechanism that once governed the fields: stimulation, anticipation, compliance. The plantation bell became the notification tone. The ledger became the algorithm. Dr. Ellison's unpublished research traced this lineage through corporate archives. One of Helix Biotech's former investors later funded a behavioral analytics firm that sold data to social media companies. Its logo, curiously, used the same intersecting, circle motif carved into the beams of Hollowcrest. When questioned, executives claimed coincidence, yet the firm's internal motto, found in leaked presentations, ready, predict, preempt, persuade. 3 words that could have been written in Nathaniel Vance's own hand. Control, after all, no longer requires chains. It requires comfort. The promise that convenience is freedom. The plantation's architecture has migrated into the human nervous system, a rhythm of distraction, of scrolling past outrage until conscience dulls. The hum that once filled the Carolina fields now vibrates through glass and signal, carried by the networks that feed you, meaning one click at a time. Ellison warned that the danger wasn't technology itself, but asymmetry. The few who design the rhythm understand its purpose. The millions who live within it mistake it for choice. She called it the Hollowcrest Continuum, a system where perception is managed, not by fear of punishment, but by the pleasure of participation. When you recognize that pattern, the world looks different. News becomes sermon, outrage becomes entertainment, leadership becomes choreography. Every empire hides its overseers behind light, and yet, awareness fractures the rhythm. The moment you hear the hum consciously, it loses some of its power. That's why exposure is forbidden. Not because it destroys the system, but because it reveals its simplicity. The plantation was never just land. It was a template, and its blueprint now glows in every screen. Breaking the rhythm begins with noticing it. The hum of control thrives in blindness, not physical, but habitual. Every empire relies on your willingness to move without question, to scroll without pause, to mistake movement for freedom. The first rebellion, then, is stillness. Awareness interrupts the pattern. In that interruption, something ancient stirs the human capacity to see without mediation. Dr. Ellison's final lectures, recorded before she resigned from the university, focused not on conspiracy, but on perception. Every architecture of obedience, she said, is built on predictability. To escape, one must act unpredictably, not chaotically, but consciously. She encouraged students to reclaim slowness, to read entire pages without skipping, to walk without headphones, to choose silence over the algorithmic hum. Small acts, but revolutionary in a culture engineered for constant motion. Her research group later published the Manual of Disruption, a slender digital pamphlet circulated quietly through forums and encrypted channels. It outlined techniques to detune, from engineered influence, breathing patterns to reset neural loops, exercises to isolate instinct from impulse, methods for re-establishing direct sensory connection with environment. It read like a meditation text but carried the rigor of a field report. One passage stood out. The hum cannot inhabit stillness, it requires participation. Each pause weakens its frequency. The irony, Ellison noted, is that the tools of control can also be tools of awakening. The same network that amplifies compliance can disseminate awareness. Each act of conscious attention ripples outward, slight, but cumulative. The plantation rhythm fractures not with rebellion, but with presence. In later interviews, survivors of cultic systems, high-pressure corporations, and propaganda regimes described similar awakenings. They all used different language: silence, grounding, disconnecting. But the result was the same. They could hear the hum and choose not to move with it. By 2025, Ellison had vanished from public life. Her final online post read, "The signal is not external. It's inherited. The same blood that once obeyed can also remember freedom." The line between history and modernity blurred once again. Hollow Crest was no longer a place. It was a condition. But if that condition could be learned, it could be unlearned. And somewhere, between silence and sound, the frequency began to falter. They came to Hollow Crest in the spring of 2026, not as believers but as researchers. 5 of Ellison's former students, linguists, data scientists, and urban anthropologists, armed with drones, scanners, and field recorders. They wanted to see if the myth still had substance, if the plantation soil held traces of the acoustic patterns she had described. The land had changed. Overgrown, subdivided, fenced, but beneath the moss and ruin, the foundation still breathed faintly. The pond had receded into a cracked depression, ringed with willow and rusted fencing. In its center, one stone remained upright, engraved with intersecting circles, the Vance symbol. They set up instruments and began recording. The data was clean for hours. Just wind, insects, distant traffic. Then, around dusk, the spectrum analyzer registered a frequency spike at 17.3 A's, low enough to vibrate the chest, but below the threshold of hearing. One student, Hana Patel, described the sensation as being remembered by the ground. Others felt disoriented. Birds fell silent. When they played back the recording, the hum was unmistakable. But instead of panic, they listened deeper. The pattern wasn't random. It carried structure, intervals matching the cadence of human breath. They realized the plantation's haunting had never been supernatural. It was resonance left by centuries of synchronized labor, grief compacted into sonic sediment. The soil itself was an archive. They began mapping the vibration, tracing how it pulsed strongest near the remnants of the slave quarters and weakened toward the manor ruins. By midnight, the frequency faded. The team stood in silence. For the first time, Hollow Crest was quiet. It wasn't exorcism, it was recognition. The act of listening without fear, without exploitation, broke the rhythm. Before leaving, Hana placed a small recorder at the site and whispered, "We hear you." Then she buried it, not to capture, but to give back sound to the earth. Months later, the recording surfaced online under the tag, Final Echo. It contained only ambient wind and water, no hum, no distortion. For the first time in 2 centuries, Hollow Crest was still. Ellison's theory had proven true. The hum needed participation to survive. Awareness ended it. And yet, as the students reviewed their data back in Rayleigh, they noticed one anomaly. In the final seconds of the audio, beneath the quiet, a faint human voice, steady, calm, almost grateful, whispered, "At last, you listened."